The sound of rain hitting tin roofs often reminded him of gunfire. Perhaps that was why Arav Malhotra rarely slept during storms. That night, the jungle outside the British Army base in Imphal was a restless ocean of sound, thunder rolling like tanks, raindrops cracking against the leaves, and the far-off echo of a world tearing itself apart. Inside his tent, Arav sat by the dim yellow flame of a kerosene lamp, his fingers trembling as he adjusted the radio dial. The Morse transmitter blinked once, then again. He hesitated for a second, looking at the canvas walls around him, and then began tapping the code that could brand him a traitor. He sent the message in short bursts: numbers, coordinates, and orders. It was information about the British supply convoy scheduled to leave for the front lines at dawn. When the last dot faded, he exhaled, his heart hammering like the drums of war. For a moment, he felt the weight of what he had done. Then he quietly unscrewed the transmitter's parts and hid them beneath the floorboards, covering them with an old blanket and a pair of muddy boots. Outside, the base was silent except for the occasional footsteps of guards. He stepped out, cigarette between his lips, his face calm, unreadable. To anyone watching, he was just another loyal Indian soldier serving under the British Crown. But in reality, he was walking a line so thin that a single whisper could hang him. Arav had joined the British Indian Army at 21, drawn not by loyalty to the Empire but by necessity. His village in Punjab had suffered under famine and war taxes. The army meant food, pay, and protection for his family. But that illusion had shattered the day he heard Subhash Chandra Bose's speech broadcast secretly through the jungle, a call for Indians to fight not for the British, but against them, for freedom. That night, his allegiance shifted forever. Now, 2 years later, Arav lived a double life: by day, the obedient Sign Alman decoding British messages; by night, the hidden hand that fed their secrets to the Azad Hind Fauj through the Japanese network. He knew betrayal was death, but freedom, he believed, was worth any price. That belief, however, was being tested. The next morning, Captain Robert Hayes entered the camp's communication tent, his sharp blue eyes scanning the room. Hayes was a man of precision and quiet authority. He had fought in North Africa before being transferred to India. Arav respected him perhaps too much for someone meant to betray him. "Morning, Malhotra," Hayes said, his British accent crisp. "You were on night watch, weren't you?" "Yes, sir," Arav replied, keeping his tone steady. "Routine transmissions. Nothing unusual." Hayes nodded, taking off his gloves. "Good. Keep your eyes open. We intercepted chatter from the Japanese last night, something about an ambush near our supply routes." Arav froze for a second. The same convoy he had just exposed. He forced a nod. "Understood, sir. I'll double-check all outgoing messages." Hayes studied him for a moment, perhaps sensing the faintest flicker of guilt. Then he clapped Arav's shoulder lightly. "I trust you, Malhotra. You're one of the few who still believes in discipline." The words cut deeper than any bullet could. Trust. That was the weapon Arav never learned to defend against. By midday, the base was alive with movement, trucks revving, soldiers loading crates, radio operators shouting coordinates. Arav sat at his desk, pretending to focus on encryption keys while his mind screamed with unease. He had sent the convoy's exact route. He knew the Japanese would strike before noon tomorrow. Every man laughing and smoking outside could be dead within a day, and he was the invisible hand pulling the trigger. He thought of home, his mother's wrinkled hands, his younger brother's laughter echoing through mustard fields, the promise he had made to return as a free man, not a servant of an empire. This is the price, he told himself. No freedom comes without blood, but he didn't know how to measure which blood mattered more. That evening, as the rain returned, a small folded paper slipped under his tent flap. He picked it up quickly, unfolding it in the dim light. It was from Leela, the courier who worked for the underground Indian nationalist network in Imphal. Her handwriting was hurried but firm. Arav, orders from Calcutta. The convoy's delay has drawn suspicion. Burn all transmissions for now. Meet at the river bridge tonight, midnight. Alone. He clenched the note, heart pounding. If Hayes's men were already suspicious, meeting her would be suicide. But if he ignored the order, he risked exposure from the other side. The British called him a soldier. The INA called him a patriot. But deep down, he knew he was neither. He was a shadow trying to please two suns. Midnight came heavy with fog. Arav slipped past the outer fences, his boots sinking into wet mud. The river bridge stood ahead, half shrouded in mist. A lantern flickered once Leela's signal. She was waiting, dressed in civilian clothes, her face pale under the weak glow. "You're late," she whispered as he approached. "Japanese command says they'll strike at dawn." Arav's chest tightened. Then it's too soon. There are still civilians near the convoy route, villagers, farmers. They'll die. Leela looked at him sharply. "You knew what this was. You can't play both sides forever, Arav." He looked away, the fog swirling around them. "I'm trying to save my people, not kill them." She sighed. "Your people will never be free if you keep hesitating. The British didn't hesitate when they took your land." Her words were knives of truth. Yet, somewhere behind her fierce patriotism, he saw the reflection of his own doubt. She handed him a new set of papers, coded messages, locations, orders to destroy the British telegraph lines before sunrise. "If you're caught," she said, "you know what to do." Arav nodded silently. The fog thickened, and by the time he looked up, she was gone. He returned to camp before dawn, every step heavier than the last. The trucks were lined up, engines rumbling, soldiers laughing, unaware of what awaited them. Hayes stood near the lead vehicle, checking his map. When he saw Arav, he waved. "Good timing, Malhotra. We roll out in 20 minutes. Arav saluted, his throat dry. The rising sun turned the mist into a blood-red haze, and for a brief moment, the world felt suspended between guilt and duty. He looked at Hayes, honest, trusting Hayes, and felt the truth clawing at his chest. As the convoy moved out, the jungle swallowed the sound of engines. Arav remained behind, staring into the trees. Somewhere out there, the trap he had helped set was waiting to spring. Somewhere out there, his country's freedom was being bought with the lives of men who had called him brother. And for the first time, he wasn't sure which side he truly belonged to. The smoke of truth. The jungle was never silent after an ambush. It carried the echoes long after the guns stopped speaking, the groan of dying engines, the crackle of burning rubber, the faint cries of men caught between duty and chaos. By the time the news reached the British base, the smoke was already visible on the horizon, a dark wound rising from the forest. Arav stood in the communications tent, the radio alive with broken voices. "Convoy hit, heavy casualties, requesting air support." The static swallowed the rest. He pressed his hands to the table, staring at the map spread open before him. He knew exactly where the attack had happened, the coordinates he had sent 3 nights ago. Captain Hayes stormed into the tent, his uniform stained with dirt, his face tight with disbelief. "It was an ambush," he said flatly. They knew our route, every turn. It wasn't random. Arav didn't look up. Could it be intercepted radio traffic, sir? The Japanese might have cracked one of the codes. Hayes shook his head. Impossible. Only 5 of us had access to that map, me, the colonel, the 2 signal officers, and you. His eyes met Arav's for just a moment, long enough to send a chill through the air. I'm not accusing you, Malhotra, he added, his voice softening, but from now on, no transmissions leave this tent without my signature. Understood? Yes, sir, Arav replied, his throat dry. When Hayes left, Arav sank into his chair. His fingers trembled, not from fear of death, but from the weight of what that death would mean. Dozens of men gone, burned alive in trucks, and he had been the invisible spark that lit the fuse. Freedom, he reminded himself, always demands sacrifice. But tonight, that word felt hollow. Outside, the sky was bruised with smoke. The rain that had poured endlessly for days had stopped, leaving behind the heavy smell of mud and fuel. Soldiers moved quietly through the camp, their faces pale, their laughter gone. Arav watched them from his tent flap. Some limped back from the ambush site, others carried stretchers covered in tarps. One of the dead wore the same wristband Arav had seen Hayes give to a young private 2 weeks ago. He turned away quickly. The jungle beyond the camp seemed darker than usual, whispering things he didn't want to hear. That night, as the wounded moaned in the medical tents, a shadow slipped into his quarters. Leela stood there, her eyes red from smoke and exhaustion. She didn't speak until he closed the flap behind her. You heard, she said. I saw the flames, Arav answered quietly. The Japanese say it was a success. Supply lines crippled, morale shattered. He looked at her, his voice low but sharp. And what about the 50 men who died? Were they just numbers on your list of victories? Leela's jaw tightened. Don't talk to me about death, Arav. You chose this. You knew what war meant. He stepped closer. I thought I did. I thought betrayal would feel like bravery. She stared at him for a long moment. You're losing your nerve, she said finally. That's dangerous. He didn't answer. She placed a small envelope on his desk. New orders. There's talk the British are moving their communication relay to Kohima. You'll intercept it before they do. It's crucial. Do this, and the command will clear your name with the Japanese. You'll be protected. Protected, he repeated bitterly. By the same people who burned those men alive. She sighed, her expression softening for the first time. Arav, this isn't about mercy. It's about purpose. You can't go back now. Neither side will forgive you if you hesitate again. When she left, the silence that followed felt heavier than the war outside. He tore open the envelope, another set of coordinates, another mission that would bleed more lives into the soil. He stared at the paper until the letters blurred. Then, without thinking, he held it over the lamp flame. The edges curled black, and in a few seconds, it was gone. The next morning, Hayes summoned him. The officer's tone was cold now, distant. Malhotra, intelligence believes we have a leak. Until further notice, all communications staff are under review. You'll report directly to me for every transmission. Yes, sir. Hayes leaned forward slightly. You were my most reliable man. Don't make me regret that. Arav nodded, the words slicing into him. By midday, rumors spread across the camp: spies, sabotage, internal betrayal. Soldiers whispered in mess lines, glancing at one another with suspicion. The jungle wasn't their only enemy anymore. That evening, Arav sat alone by the edge of the compound, watching the horizon burn with sunset. The forest glowed gold, indifferent to human suffering. Somewhere out there, Leela was waiting for his report. Somewhere, the Aina command wondered if he was still loyal. And somewhere, deep inside, a voice whispered that maybe he had already lost both sides. A small sound broke his thoughts, the crunch of boots behind him. He turned to see Hayes, holding a cigarette in one hand. He offered one to Arav. "Hell of a day," Hayes murmured. "Yes, sir." Hayes exhaled smoke, his gaze on the distance. "You know, back in Africa, I lost an entire unit to bad intel. Turned out one of our men had been feeding information to the enemy. When we caught him, he didn't beg. He just said, 'Every man fights for something.'" Arav stayed silent. Hayes looked at him then, eyes tired but sharp. "Tell me, Malhotra, what are you fighting for?" For a heartbeat, Arav's mask almost cracked. The truth clawed its way up his throat but never escaped. "For survival, sir," he said instead. Hayes nodded slowly. "That's fair." He turned to leave, then added, "Survival is good, Malhotra. But don't confuse it with loyalty." When he was gone, the words echoed like thunder in Arav's mind. He realized then that the line he had walked so carefully was starting to crumble beneath his feet. Both sides were watching, waiting for him to slip. As night fell, he sat again before the dead radio. The jungle outside whispered through the trees, and somewhere far away, artillery rumbled like a heartbeat. He placed his hands on the transmitter but didn't switch it on. For the first time since the war began, he didn't know which message to send or which version of himself would survive if he did. The weight of silence. By dawn, the camp was no longer the same. The men who once laughed over tin cups now avoided each other's eyes. The rain had returned, steady and cold, soaking through uniforms and spirits alike. Somewhere beyond the mist, the jungle seemed to breathe heavier, as if it too sensed the growing distrust among those who claimed to fight on the same side. Arav walked through the rows of tents, his boots sinking into wet mud. The air carried the bitter smell of burnt fuel and antiseptic from the medical tent. Inside, the wounded from the convoy attack groaned in restless sleep. Every face he saw seemed to accuse him of something only he knew. He wanted to look away, but the guilt had already followed him like a shadow that refused to leave. Captain Hayes was standing near the command tent, speaking with two officers from the intelligence division. Their khaki coats were spotless despite the rain, their expressions sharp and detached. One of them, a thin man with a polished accent, caught Arav's eye and gestured for him to come forward. "Sign Alman Malhotra, isn't it?" the officer said. "We'll be reviewing all communication logs from the last 2 weeks. Standard procedure." Arav nodded calmly, though he could feel sweat forming under his collar. "Of course, sir. Everything is filed." "Good," the man replied, his gaze lingering on Arav's face a moment too long. Sometimes the smallest errors reveal the biggest secrets. When they left, Hayes looked at him briefly. There was no anger in his eyes, just disappointment, a quiet, almost fatherly kind of hurt. Arav saluted and turned away, hiding the tremor in his hands. Back inside the communications tent, he began sorting through the files, checking for anything that could link him to the transmissions he'd sent. Every sheet of paper felt heavier than it should have, as though the ink itself was soaked in guilt. He burned the old cipher pads one by one, pretending it was part of the cleanup routine. Each flame seemed to whisper a word he didn't want to hear: traitor. That evening, the intelligence officers returned for questioning. They went through every operator, one at a time. Arav waited outside under the awning, rain dripping from the roof, his stomach coiled with unease. He could hear voices through the canvas, muffled, tense, interrogations wrapped in polite tones. When his turn came, he stepped inside and saluted. The thin officer leaned forward. "Tell me, Malhotra, where were you during the night of the 10th? "On radio duty, sir," Arav replied smoothly. "Routine message relay. Nothing classified. Any contact with civilian personnel?" He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then shook his head. "No, sir." The officer smiled faintly. "You're a good liar, Malhotra. But not good enough." Arav met his gaze without flinching. "If you have proof, sir, I'll accept whatever punishment is due." "Proof," the man repeated softly, "is a matter of time." They dismissed him soon after. Outside, Hayes stood waiting, smoking under the rain. "They're under pressure from Delhi," he said quietly. "Someone will take the blame for the ambush. I'm trying to keep you out of their sight, but you need to be careful." "Thank you, sir," Arav murmured. The gratitude felt wrong on his tongue. That night, unable to sleep, he found himself walking toward the edge of the jungle. The rain had stopped, and a thin mist hung over the trees. From somewhere far away came the faint rumble of artillery. He thought of Leela, her sharp eyes, her unwavering faith in the cause, her warning that hesitation was death. He wondered if she knew he was being watched. He wondered if she'd already abandoned him. A faint rustle behind him made him turn. A soldier stood there, holding a lantern. It was Private Singh, one of the younger men Arav had trained. "Sir," Singh said hesitantly, "Captain Hayes asked me to give you this." He handed him a small envelope, saluted, and disappeared into the fog. Inside was a brief note in Hayes's handwriting. "Orders changed. Relay station moving tomorrow. Meet me at the North Ridge at first light. Hayes." Arav read it twice, uneasy. Hayes rarely wrote anything down, especially orders. Something about the message felt off, too direct, too exposed. Still, refusing an officer's order would draw more suspicion. He tucked the paper into his pocket and went back to his tent, though sleep never came. When dawn finally broke, the mist lay thick over the camp. He made his way toward the ridge, the path quiet except for the drip of rain from the leaves. The closer he got, the more his instincts screamed that something was wrong. No guards, no vehicles, no sign of Hayes. Only the sound of birds scattering from the trees. Then he saw two figures stepping out of the fog, not Hayes, but the intelligence officers from yesterday. The thin one smiled like a man who had waited too long for this moment. "Good morning, Malhotra," he said evenly. "Expecting someone else?" Arav's heart pounded. "Captain Hayes sent for me." "Oh, I'm sure he did," the man replied, holding up the same envelope Arav had received. "We borrowed his handwriting. A little test of loyalty, you could say." Two soldiers moved behind Arav, rifles ready. For a moment, no one spoke. The jungle seemed to hold its breath. "You've been transmitting unauthorized messages," the officer continued. "We traced faint signal residues near your quarters. Clever setup, by the way. But not clever enough." Arav's mind raced. He could run, but there was nowhere to go. He could lie, but lies had already dug his grave. So he said nothing. Hayes appeared from the mist then, his face pale, eyes unreadable. "Stand down," he told the guards. They hesitated, then lowered their rifles. "Let me speak to him alone." When the others left, Hayes stepped closer. "Tell me the truth, Arav. Were you working for them?" Arav looked away. "I was working for India." Hayes's voice broke. "You think betrayal is patriotism? Maybe it's the only kind that matters," Arav said quietly. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Hayes nodded slowly, almost sadly. "You'll be confined until command decides your fate. I'll try to keep the court-martial quiet. You deserve better than a firing squad." As soldiers led him back to camp, Arav didn't struggle. The jungle blurred into a wash of green and gray. Somewhere deep inside, the part of him that once believed in victory began to fade. He had wanted to fight for freedom. Instead, he had become a prisoner of both the empire and the revolution, a man without a country, without forgiveness, trapped between two causes that no longer remembered his name. The last message. The cell was small, damp, and windowless. A single lamp flickered overhead, throwing restless shadows across the cracked concrete walls. Arav Malhotra sat on a narrow cot, wrists bound, his uniform torn and streaked with mud. The silence in the room was heavier than any interrogation. Outside, the war roared on, but inside, time had stopped. 3 days had passed since his arrest. The court-martial had been swift, silent, and certain. The evidence was enough: intercepted codes, burned papers, a transmitter buried under his floorboards. He had confessed nothing, denied nothing. The verdict had already been decided the moment suspicion had fallen on him. High treason in wartime, the punishment, execution at dawn. Arav had imagined death many times, but never like this, not as a spectacle of betrayal, not as a story whispered by those who would never know the truth. He had fought for a country that existed only as an idea, and now, that same idea was all he had left. Footsteps echoed in the corridor. The cell door opened, and Captain Hayes stepped inside. He looked older, exhausted, the lines around his eyes deeper. In his hand, he carried a folder and a tin cup of tea. "I thought you might want something warm," Hayes said quietly, placing it on the floor. Arav didn't move. The captain studied him for a moment, then sat down on the opposite chair. "They're transferring you to Kohima tomorrow." After that, his voice trailed off. "I tried to appeal for a delay. They wouldn't listen." Arav finally looked up. "You shouldn't have." Hayes sighed. "I don't understand you, Malhotra. You were one of the best. You could have had a future here." "There is no here, sir," Arav replied, his tone calm but distant. "This uniform, this war, none of it belongs to me." Hayes's eyes softened. "And what about the men who died because of your messages? Did they belong to you?" Arav closed his eyes. "They were victims of a larger lie. The kind both of us served." For a long time, neither spoke. The rain outside had begun again, a slow rhythm against the metal roof. Finally, Hayes reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded paper. "This came for you. From the outside. I don't know how they managed it." Arav took it hesitantly. The handwriting was familiar, Leela's. He unfolded it slowly. "The cause continues. You did what was needed. Don't regret it. History will remember those who bled unseen. L. He stared at the words for a long time, his chest heavy with something he couldn't name. He wondered if history really would remember, or if it would bury him like all the others, a traitor in the records, a ghost in the silence of victory. "Do you believe any of it was worth it?" Hayes asked, breaking the quiet. Arav smiled faintly. "Belief is the only thing they can't take from me." Hayes stood up, his jaw set. "I'll make sure they don't drag your name through the mud. That's all I can do." As he left, Arav's gaze followed him. Despite everything, there was no hatred, only an unspoken understanding between two soldiers trapped on opposite sides of the same lie. Night fell heavy and endless. The guards posted outside the cell whispered to each other, unaware that every word echoed in the prisoner's ears. Arav sat motionless, the letter still in his hand. Somewhere beyond the base, artillery flashed faintly through the clouds, lightning disguised as war. He thought of his mother's voice calling him back from the fields, of the smell of wet earth after the first rain, of a world untouched by uniforms and empires. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel peace. Just before midnight, the lock on his cell clicked open. Arav looked up to see Leela standing in the doorway, drenched from the rain, her eyes glinting in the half-light. How he began, but she pressed a finger to her lips. "No time. There's a truck waiting behind the old ammunition shed. I bribed the guards. You can still get out." Arav stared at her. "If I run, they'll kill you." "They'll kill you anyway," she whispered. "You've done enough for them. Live now. That's the only rebellion left." For a moment, the world shrank to the sound of their breaths. Then Arav shook his head slowly. "No, Leela. If I run, I'll only prove them right." She stepped closer, her voice breaking. "You'll die for people who don't even know your name." He smiled faintly. "That's what freedom always demands, faith in those who'll never remember you." Tears welled in her eyes. She tried to speak, but words refused to come. Finally, she reached into her coat and handed him a small folded scrap, a photograph of the tricolor flag painted on a torn piece of fabric. "Then take this," she said. "So they don't bury you as one of theirs." He took it gently, his fingers brushing hers for the last time. "Go," he whispered. "Before they find you." She hesitated, then turned and disappeared into the dark corridor, her footsteps fading with the storm. When the dawn finally broke, it came cold and colorless. The courtyard outside the barracks was slick with rain. Soldiers stood in formation, silent, their rifles gleaming. Arav walked between them calmly, the chains at his wrists clinking softly. Hayes followed a few steps behind, his face unreadable. At the far end stood the firing squad. Arav stopped, facing the gray horizon. He could hear the rustle of the flag above, the same flag he had once saluted, the same empire he had chosen to betray. The officer read out the sentence. The words drifted away in the wind. Arav's thoughts were elsewhere, in the sound of his mother's laughter, in Leela's trembling hands, in the unseen faces of those who would inherit the freedom he had only dreamed of. When they asked for his final words, he spoke softly, barely above the whisper of the rain. "Tell them I fought for both sides, because both forgot what they were fighting for." The command was given. The rifles rose. The shots rang out once, sharp and final. The jungle absorbed the sound, and the rain began again. Later that evening, Hayes stood alone near the burial ground behind the camp. In his hand, he held the small scrap of fabric they had found in Arav's pocket, a torn piece painted in saffron, white, and green. He placed it on the grave and whispered, "Maybe someday, they'll know who you really were. The wind carried the sound away, and for the first time, the rain seemed to fall gently as if the sky itself mourned a man who had lived between two flags, and belonged completely